Thank you for joining us today at Writer's Lunch. We do this every week and we have a lot of fun. Today, I'm going to be doing a spin off of a event that I did about a year ago, and we'll be talking specifically about writing mystery series rather than just one mystery book. Feel free to include your favorite mystery series in the chat while we get going. All right, so this is Writer's Lunch, writing a mystery series, and we're going to be talking about all sorts of mystery stuff. So a little bit about me before we go. I'm one of the co-founders of the Tomeworks Editing Collective. I've also co-founded Houston Independent Authors, which has been doing events like this for over 7 years around Houston. I'm one of the meetup organizers for the Houston Science Fiction and Fantasy Group, and we meet twice a month at this point, one day to write and one day to chill out and have community. And it's the oldest socialization group for sci-fi and fantasy authors in Houston. So that's really cool. I'm also the co-coordinator of the Houston chapter of the Editorial Freelancers Association, and I'm also the continuity editor for Cursed Dragon Ship Publishing. What's not on here is that I also teach for the Editorial Freelancers Association. I'm going to start teaching editing mystery writing in the fall, and I currently teach their class on editing science fiction and fantasy. So that's a little bit about me. The first thing that I kind of want to talk about, and hopefully I can get through this relatively quickly, is that everything you kind of know about the main character, what you've been told about what makes a good main character when it comes to mystery, is wrong. If you've been taught the hero's journey and you've been told that, your character has to be a driver of action and they've got to be manifesting change from the get-go and that they have to go on this change of personality or this rite of passage, that's actually not quite right for mystery writing. And it's kind of funny because we teach the hero's journey a lot, but the two largest genres of that people read, like the two high-selling genres, fall under romance and they fall under mystery, thrillers, and suspense. And for both of those major genre categories, that's not correct. That's not correct. Your hero's journey doesn't really fly with them. So I want to talk just a little bit about what you do expect to see with a detective, even if it's a cozy detective or a hard-boiled detective or somebody who's an amateur sleuth. You're going to have some very specific differences from what you might have been told about what a protagonist should look like. Your detective is actually going to be kind of static. They are reactive. They're not going out there in the middle of the night looking for dead bodies, generally speaking. You're going to have an expectation that they're going to be sort of woken up or dragged from whatever it is that they're doing to deal with whatever the mystery is or deal with the first body. And so they are not really the drivers of the story. They get added into the story once it's already started. It's just being told from the point of view of that detective. Your detective should already kind of be fully formed. This is not necessarily true for origin stories, especially when it comes to cozy mysteries or amateur sleuths. But generally speaking, when the detective comes into the story, they're not some green stick new guy who this is their first case. Again, unless you're doing their origin story, but that's kind of rare. There's somebody who's already had experience. They've had a life experience. They've had losses. They've got something in their history that has taught him how to take on this role of detective. So they are the observer of others. They are not necessarily the driver of the action in the story. And in all honesty, even though we are following them most of the time, they're not going to be the most interesting characters on the page because that might be taken up with the actual bad guy. It might be taken up with your secondary characters and your red herring characters that are going to grab attention and act suspiciously, drag the reader to be like, okay, did they do it? Your hero, your detective, may not be the driver of the story. They may not change appreciably throughout that story. They may not be, proactive for good portions of your introduction because the story is coming to them. And they may not learn anything that alters their core personality throughout this investigation. And it's still a-okay. Now, you don't want somebody who's, 100% boring. But, those things that we consider the hallmarks of a hero don't necessarily fit when it comes to detective novels. The important thing for you, though, is that your character, even if they are static, that they aren't flat. This means that they have to come fully formed on the page. They have to have very clear, complex histories, as we already talked about. They have to be a unique character, so that we recognize when they're talking, when they're thinking, and we're getting their perspective, because that's what's drawing us into the circumstance they're in. If they're not fun, even if your definition of fun is miserable, because a lot of detectives are miserable, then you're not going to have reader attention. But these characters, they show up. Their personality, their physicality, if they, especially if they have some sort of past history of injury, that's already there. That exists. Their mood and their vibes and their general demeanor should already exist. If they have quirks in how they talk or who they talk to, or what they won't say out loud, and their philosophies, they should already have a pretty full suite of ethics. And those things should be on the page and recognizable and kind of exist without the mystery having a bearing on them necessarily. So this person, even without the mystery, should exist, even if they're not exploring a whodunit or what have you. They still exist outside of that. And so when you're starting to plan your novel, please recognize, like, you don't need to build them into somebody new, but they have to show up on the page already set. So one of the things that's really important for authors is to come at the process of making the mystery by actually starting off with character sheets for your detective. And so if you haven't made a character sheet before, it includes a bunch of identifiers and qualities about the character so that you can display them on the page. So we talked about a few of these in the previous slide. These would be things like the external characteristics of the character. And this could be like scars that they already have from past, past traumas, if they've ever been in a car wreck, if they were shot in the line of duty, and that kind of thing. These are external characteristics that should already exist even before you start book one. The internal characteristics and the drivers should be there. So if this person was an orphan, and the thing that's driving them through the entire series is trying to figure out who killed their parents, you need to know that. You need to know that in book one. If they have specific, appearance things, of course, if they're heavy set, if they're skinny, if they're tall, if they're short, they have impetigo, if they've got birthmarks, that kind of thing. So you want to make sure that you can draw from that to talk about that. Another important thing is to figure out, part of their background is what their skill sets are, because it's important for your detective to be able to detect. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we start talking about plot. But your detective needs to have skills, and they have to have a history that falls in line with the person being able to display those skills. So I wouldn't necessarily expect a homemaker who's never had any experience besides growing up in middle class America, maybe playing clarinet in high school and then immediately having kids and tending house, to be able to know necessarily what color phosphorus is when it burns. So if you are going to have a character who seems like they would not make a good detective, but they are going to need these backgrounds in order to detect, you're going to have to build in the why. And crazy stuff happens. Maybe that homemaker didn't grow up in middle America. Maybe they grew up in a domestic terrorism cult until they were 15 and escaped it and just wants to be normal. But that might give them some of the skills they would need to recognize information about bombs or details about the way people start cults that other people wouldn't know. And so their background, their histories, and then again, those skill sets and knowledge bases would have to come from somewhere. Another thing you want to also include is the qualifiers, the things that trip the characters up, because then you can add those fun things into the story. If you have a detective who's really afraid of water and they're going to have to chase a bad guy across a bridge, that's a lot more exciting if you have a reason why, and if it's developed before the story starts, meaning that you understand why they have that problem and that those hindrances are built into the character. You may also want to have some identifying factors. This could be things like specific phrases that character uses all the time, calling cards, and belief systems that may be different than just like a regular person off the street. You also want to build in the history of their situation. We talked a little bit about that with, them being an orphan, or perhaps they lost their job because somebody framed them, and their desire might be to get their good name back, to remove the tarnish on their reputation. You would also like to know, more information about their family, their relationships, both here and now, but also in the past. And then if you're writing something that is speculative or supernatural, or even in the future, necessarily something that's magical, you want to know what technology they have. And then if they do have magical abilities, those should be something that you've sort of parsed out so that those things don't change throughout your series. So, for instance, if in the future you have like a handy dandy lie detector that you can carry around with you, you don't want to have that just like show up in book 3 because why wouldn't they have used it the entire time? Or if your character is psychic, but the ghosts that the main character talks to can only say 3 words at a time, you don't want to just have for no reason them expand that out to 10 words or a full 1 minute's worth of conversation that they can have. You want to figure out what the limitations are beforehand. And then that way the little gimmies that you have for your subgenre don't feel inconsistent. All right. Most of the time, now you can definitely write in the comment section you found something that this doesn't apply to, and there are some subgenres that it doesn't, but most of the time your detective, your static protagonist, comes into the story already defined by a loss. If you think of them as an actual hero, the main body of their story has already happened. Their pain is usually extensive and deep because they have lost family, because they have lost respectability, because they have been, kicked off of their dream job, or they have had something that they should have gotten in a status or opportunity way stolen from them. If they've been framed for something, maybe they lost the scholarship to college, or maybe they were given a military discharge that was less than honorable because they had some really big bad terrible thing pinned on them that wasn't really their fault. So you want to know what they have lost, and you want to know what they're trying to accomplish throughout the series, irrespective of the mysteries. And most of the time, whatever it is that they've lost, that's what they're just trying to get back, right? If they've become somebody who doesn't have any security in life because, again, they've lost the status or the respect, and they are a down on their luck, gritty detective, then one of the things that they're almost always trying to do is make sure they have the things that come with, the sense of having enough money to be secure. Or if they've lost their spouse, the end goal may be to not necessarily get a new spouse, but to find love again. And so you want to think about these things before you actually write the mystery, because you need to define how the character has had loss in their past, so that you can put their pain on the page, regardless of which mystery they're solving at the moment. But you also know how to use that pain and amplify the problems that the detective has throughout that mystery by kind of, doing those tiny jabs to them, right? So if they have lost a child, if a child got kidnapped, then, having a experience where they're trying to investigate maybe the murder of somebody and then find out that there's a child who's missing, that's going to really play into their trauma. It's good to know these things ahead so that you're not backtracking and rewriting that character again, paid in the 3rd or 4th book in your series. So this is another way where the hero's journey stuff just does not work. Wants and needs are usually the same thing, whereas in the hero's journey, your wants and your needs diverge pretty quickly, right? Because the wants that the person has before they go on their journey while they're in the regular world usually turn out to be the thing that, if they actually accepted, would destroy their growth. So this is different because, you lost your parents, you want your parents back. You want it, you need it, it's the same thing. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a fatal flaw to accept wanting or needing that thing. It's not destructive to the character's personality to embrace the want. And then the hero may not even know what they want consciously, and that's totally fine, but you should know as the writer. And this is also kind of different from the hero's journey because most of the time the character knows pretty clearly what they want, but they may not recognize what they need until a little bit later in the book. Again, With the mystery, we don't need to grow that necessarily. Or the changes between what they want may be minor and not life-changing. It may not have to be something that alters who that detective is. So then we kind of actually get into how do you write your mystery. For your secondary characters, your static protagonist is going to be a representation of certain things. Now, you do have mysteries and thrillers where you have a superhero kind of character. And especially with thriller, you may have somebody who's like the big tough guy who is trying to save somebody who's in distress. So you think you're like Jack Reacher character, or your espionage thrillers, your James Bond kind of characters. They're a paragon of virtue. They come to you as a classic hero. They are, super strong, super smart, sometimes, and they can withstand a lot of damage that a regular person could not physically. So they have a representation of being almost godlike in their physical skills. Your normal mysteries, often the detective is a sage force. Sorry about the extra D there, to give guidance because of the circumstance they're in. This doesn't always translate because, especially if you get into like gritty noir, it could be that the person who's drowning sees the detective as the buoy or the life preserver, and they aren't necessarily like super smart or super strong. They may also be the person that the intended victim just is going to shove in front of the car so they don't get hit. However, most detective stories, the detective is like the only person who might help the intended victim out, and so they cling to them. This is somebody who is going to save me, and they're the only one that can help me. Sometimes you will have other things, especially in suspense, where you have, a adventurer type character who does most of the getting us into trouble, but also has to get us back out again. Often they are louder, they are the loudest voice in the room, and so they are followed. And they also usually create friendships, or they create community very quickly so that they have other people around when either terrible things go down, or so that they have somebody that they can run to when the stuff goes bad who can help them out. So most series are episodic when it comes to thrillers. It's not necessarily going to be a journey where you have really distinct differences from one to the other as far as like what the character situation is, the detective situation is from one to the other. Although, minor differences are good to have. But your secondary characters are really the drivers of the story, and it's important to make sure that you're not falling into tropes territory, and that you make these secondary characters or the intended victims dynamic people who are interesting to the reader. Because again, even though they are coming back for your detective, you need to give them new and interesting situations and people to follow for each individual book. So they need to be, either the hero or the victim of their own story. Their peril is what drives the actual plot. And they pull your detective or your static protagonist because of their need, because of the situation they're in. And most of the time, these characters have to be in what we consider a stuck gum scenario, where they are trying to fix things, but they make it worse. Kind of like if you get gum stuck in your hair, if you've ever had that happen to you, and you try to pull it out, more than likely you just get more and more strands stuck in it. And you need somebody else to help you get that crap out. So the more that they do to try to unstick themselves, the worse it is. And that's the reason why they need the detective or your static hero to help them. I want to start talking about what you put into your individual stories, and then we'll marry the detective and the actual stories near the end. Your situation and circumstance is going to be two very different things, and these are the situation and circumstance for the intended victim or the protagonist of each story, separate from the detective. Okay, so when you have somebody who is going to be your intended victim, they are going to have a problem that brings the detective in, right? Somebody has kidnapped my child. Somebody is sending me death threats. Something is going on. The circumstance that they are in are the convoluting factors or the larger issues surrounding this acute problem. Most of the time, they don't announce this to the detective. And if they had, the whole case would have been solved a lot easier. But the secrets that they're holding, or the secrets maybe they don't even know about the circumstance they're in, are often the keys to solving the case or solving the problem. So, for instance, this is a speculative one. My soon-to-be father-in-law turned into a giant opera-singing plant right after I asked my girlfriend's hand in marriage. His answer to that question is he told me never, and then all of his singing is about a wizard who I pissed off like years and years ago. So now I need the detective's help because I'm in this situation. How do I turn my soon-to-be father-in-law back into a person who's not an opera-singing plant? And how do I get this curse off of me? And so the situation that they're in is like, well, I got told no to marrying the person I want to marry. But the circumstance they are in is a little bit different than that because the real problem here is that they've pissed off a wizard. At least we think they've pissed off a wizard. Maybe this is a cover for somebody else they've pissed off. Maybe they're being sent to go bother that wizard because the person who really wants them dead knows the wizard might do that for them, right? Like, I'm going to go send you into peril thinking that a certain circumstance is going on so that your conflict is inevitable and that I don't have to do the dirty work. It could be a whole lot of things, but the circumstance that they are in really delineates what the shape of the story is. Anna, would you read the next example on here for me?
Yes. My mistress was murdered right after she told me she was going to spill the beans to the tabloids, ruin my marriage, and ensure I'd never get reelected.
So in this situation, it isn't even just that your loved one is dead, right? There's these circumstantial things that are occurring around this death that are going to make it a lot harder to figure out who would want the mistress dead. And all of them seem like things that would point to you, Anna. This is your
Right.
mistress,
I was gonna
as the
say, it feels
person.
like that's burying the lead in that
Yeah.
second one.
But anybody who might know about this mistress doing what she's going to do could be, also interested in their death, may benefit from it. If my wife doesn't care that our marriage is a marriage of convenience and doesn't want to have to play the part of the scorned spouse, maybe they want to kill the mistress before she can say anything so they can keep their status. Maybe somebody inside of my election team or inside the government, doesn't care that I'm keeping a mistress, but thinks that I need to stay in my position to help. That the ends justify the means, and that if they ruin my good name, then all of the political things that I was working towards in my last term are going to go to pot. They might kill my mistress. There's all sorts of other people who could be involved who want to kill my mistress, or excuse me, your mistress. Unless we share a dead mistress. So these are the things that are really going to make the story. And it's easy to get kind of bogged down, like, how do I make something interesting when everything is like, hey, there's a dead body? But that is the way you add circumstance. Anna, would you read this last one?
Yeah. My bank accounts have been drained and my accountant has disappeared without a trace. My accountant is also my first wife. She found out that I've been draining funds from my business into my own personal accounts, and I've ignored and neglected my daughter for years.
Anna, you're just a bad spouse, man. But
Ooh,
it's
say it.
Yeah, but I mean, all of these things they impact both the arc of the story, but they also impact how the static protagonist or your detective play into the story as well. So, regardless of whatever the situation is, your protagonist slash your detective's behavior is going to play into that larger circumstance. It's going to admire the larger circumstance and change it. So for that last example, the hired detective can't necessarily openly investigate all the family members or friends, or red herring characters, because if they do so openly and honestly, it goes ahead and reveals the prime target's secrets. And those are obviously things that they're trying to keep. So those circumstances make the process of detecting harder. However, if, say, I'm going to reveal one of those secrets in a gambit to see if I can get you to be more honest too, because I've surprised you, and I've kind of thrown something out of left field and you don't have time to put your poker face on, I may do that. I might share something that that'll shock you to see if I can get better honesty out of you. So these things all have an interplay. And it's important to think about the circumstances when you decide how your detective is actually going to go out there and detect. And then that way, when they do, it can make it feel like a more lived in a story because the actions of the detective have consequences. The lies of the prime target have consequences. Everybody's consequences snowball into more threat and more stakes for the characters who are in the story. Most of the time, you will have a series antagonist who may not be in every single book. The series antagonist and the book antagonist are going to be different because the series antagonist is the antagonist that occurs for your static protagonist slash your detective, though they can be a problem or they can be a character in the books. So if you think about like Moriarty, he's not in every single Sherlock Holmes book, but he's in enough of them that you know he's gonna, probably show back up. Or even if he's not the person who's the direct antagonist in each story, he might be behind them. Like he might be funding them or he might be sending them. They may be one of his stoolies or something like that. But you may not recognize him on the street, but he's behind everything. So Red John and the Mentalist is also another example of this. Most of the time, these characters will either be absent and just talked about, or they may be covert. So they start off looking like an ally of your detective in the first few books, or somebody who, even if they're not like a true ally, isn't a direct threat. They may just be a character on the page. One of the things that I think was pretty cool with the Sherlock Holmes that came out in the 2000s with Benjamin Cumberbatch. I'm going to say his name wrong. Did I say that right? But anyway, his Moriarty is like a lab tech, and he's just like some dupe. He's on the screen here and there, and does not. He is absolutely harmless seeming, and then it turns out that he's the bad guy. So your covert antagonist is pretty common, and it helps us see that character and have a visual of that character before we know the purpose and the larger arc. So yeah, you very much see the double crosser, the abandoner, the person who's willing to sacrifice others. Martin Whitley, the dad in the prodigal son, proves that he is willing to kill his son, like in the series finale. Sorry if that's the spoiler. Tom Ripley is actually an anti-hero, and his thrillers are all about whether or not he's going to get caught. But for most of the characters, if you were trying to look at it from the opposite point of view, he would be the bad guy, and they would realize it near when they get killed. Paul Spector from The Fall, and then even Saruman to Gandalf. We have these characters who we think we know, and you have to read or watch the content towards the middle or towards the end to realize, oh shit, we didn't actually know them at all. Your series antagonist, often at the very beginning of your series, should have more power than your actual hero, your static hero. And this is because your hero has to learn who they are and what their actual like nefarious plan is. And so, especially if the detective is down on their luck because of previous actions of this antagonist, they're not going to be in a position to really fight back. It's through the slow growth of the series that they have enough friends, enough either funding or stability, and enough, sense of hope again that they can truly fight back against this character. The series antagonist doesn't have to cause the static protagonist's original loss. Like the series, antagonist isn't necessarily going to be the one that orphaned your protagonist as a child, but they have to believe that your static protagonist is to blame for their own losses. So they either destroy because they've been destroying for forever. They destroy the series protagonist before this series begins because they see them as a threat, or they see them as somebody who has already caused them harm. Throughout the story, the series antagonists will actually end up proving themselves to be a sibling in skill and mental capacity. Once we know we are fighting a specific antagonist, even if we can't ID them on the street, if we have a name or if we have a shadow group or something like that, we need to have a repartee, essentially. Like, we have to have the duel that doesn't have a winner through books and books and books and books until you're ready to end the series. So when you are planning your series antagonist, you want to do the same thing where you create that character ahead of time. You write down all of their skills, you write down all of their personality, you write their backstory, you give yourself a character sheet so that you can do like a skill swapping thing where you can say, okay, The series antagonist has to be really good at this because the protagonist is also really good at this. And it's going to be kind of a crapshoot whether or not the protagonist can actually figure out their plan and save the day. Which of course in some books they don't, but presumably most of the time you want them to win, even if it's a very small win. Often they are from a very similar background as the static lead. This helps because then you can put them in the same place at the same time, and cause the original conflict. But you don't necessarily have to do it that way. There are some books where the antagonist does not care about the static protagonist, knows who it was that screwed them over, and is coming for them. And so the series antagonist is kind of in a swap position where now they are directly trying to fight the series protagonist because the protagonist has a vendetta. Hubris and zealotry and jealousy will often be their undoing. So your antagonist will have to make choices because they believe that they can get away with it, or they have to believe that they are fighting a true cause. And this will be their undoing because they won't look at the situation and realize that they need to back off. We're going to talk a little bit about the shape of story. I think I've got time. This may be a very confusing graph, and for that, I apologize. If you have any background with like setting the shape of story, this is something that Kurt Vonnegut, I think he was the first person I knew that talked about the shape of story, but I don't think he truly invented the idea of story shapes. But basically, there's different kinds of stories. So you could have the person starts off happy, they have something bad happen, good things happen, they're happy again. I can't see my hand. And so, there's a lot of hero's journey stories that start off like that. And then you can have the man in the hole where everything starts off good. Oh shit, I fell in a hole. Kind of stay in that hole. A lot of detective and thriller novels are shaped like a Cinderella story. And by that, I mean, they were really happy before the story started. Something terrible happened, like, oh shit. And then your story starts. So when you think about Cinderella, the worst thing that's ever happened in her life happens before the story starts. Most of us don't tell the story with her being a happy kid, her dad dying, right? That's part of the backstory. And we start off with Cinderella when she's at her low. But the worst thing that's already happened has already happened. And then she's got, some friends and they help her out. And then she gets to go to the ball and these really nice things happen. And then she just kind of goes back down because like, ah, crap, I got to run away and I don't want the friends to see me, in my regular raggedy clothes. And this is kind of miserable. And then boop, she's the queen. Detective stories are very similar. The worst thing that's ever happened to them, their parents died, they lost a job, they've been framed. The worst thing that ever happened starts before the story. You start here when they're kind of down. They're still kind of miserable, but then things get better as they detect throughout the story. And then normally we have a fuck up. Somebody they care about dies. Somebody that they intended to save gets mortally hurt. It's still not the worst thing that's ever happened to them. But it does suck. And then they solve the case. And they're at a relative high. And my little schematic doesn't look great because I had to shorten this arrow, but this is still lower than this. So they hit a peak. And some stories will end with the static protagonist or your detective at that peak. And some of them will almost immediately drop them back down again. And so you need to think about how you want the shapes of your stories to occur, because are they ending on a high, or after they've solved the case, and then they realize like, well, I didn't get the thing I wanted. Like, they help somebody out and everything turned out great in this mystery, and then that person gets hit by a car. Like, do you want to end it on that downer or not? So most detective novels are Cinderella, and throughout the story, you may want to have some rug pulls to send them back down to where they started at. Especially if you want this to be a really long series, you may want to, have that variability. Anna in the comment section says, does whether you end on a higher note depend partially on whether or not your book is going to have a sequel? I mean, yes and no. I do know I think it's more of a genre thing, actually. It's the variability, it has to do with genre. Because in almost every single noir series that I've read, it ends on a low note. The win is temporary, it's short-lived, the world is still miserable. If you're looking at thrillers, and the way they usually do those is like, oh, you won and you think everything is safe, and then in your epilogue, even if the detective isn't part of it or the hero isn't part of it, we get information about a bigger threat or somebody else who's actually concocting this nefarious plan, and it's all falling into place. So even if the detective doesn't know about it, they have that rug pull because it's coming. So I would look to genre a little bit more to determine whether or not you should do that. Another thing too is like cozies don't ever rug pull. I mean, it's very rare to have a rug pull, and if it is, it's a gentle rug pull for cozies. All right, so let's talk about the story and series arcs, right? Generally speaking, again, these are static characters. They're not flat, they're static. They stay the same, or the change that they have is so minute that you may only see a dynamic change in one or two of the books out of like five or 10. So getting what the static protagonist wants does not constitute dynamic change. If your new love, you get a new love if your old one was murdered. You have a found family if your family was taken away from you. If were trying to figure out what happened to your parents and why you're orphaned, you discover the answer. If your name was besmirched, then you get your good name returned to you once you've vindicated yourself. So if you get what you wanted, that's not really the same thing as dynamic change. I just want to make that clear because yeah, that will happen, but it was the goal the whole time. So one of the things that it's important to do is planning your arc, because you don't want to end up writing a series and it get really big and then figure out you can't end it. And a lot of the very early, like golden era detective stories, the authors got so tired of writing about them that they killed them off. They had a lot of backlash and outcry, and audience that just pissed about that. Sherlock stuttered to death essentially because the author just couldn't stand writing about him. But every time that he tried to kill him off or tried to end the series, there would be scathing direct, threats, or people would take out ads to talk about what a jerk he was for not continuing to write. And it became very personal. And I don't think we're going to see a lot of that now. But you don't want to get disillusioned with your own writing. You don't want to write yourself in a corner so that you can't end your series. And you definitely want to have a clear end point. But I really urge you not to kill your character off for your own good, for your own sanity. So it's important to plan your series arc and figure out ways to include it in the stories themselves. And one of the easiest ways to do this, if you've ever done any sort of screenwriting or you followed episodic story detective series on TV, is to use the A, B, and C story model. And so what that means is that your A story is the situational plot inside of each show or installment. And so that's the actual mystery that's being solved, or the actual like part of the mystery that's being solved. Because sometimes there's mysteries that go over the course of multiple books. Your B story is the static protagonist side plot. And this is, the story that has to do with the static protagonist, and it does carry over. So, say they have a relationship, and they're trying to maintain the relationship while also being incredibly busy, beat down, beat detective with the police force. So their B story is going to be the fights they have with their spouse, or them having to deal with disgruntled children who are starting to not like them because they're never around or they're always miserable. Or the things that will continue on through the story, but aren't necessarily the C story or the runner, which is the static protagonist journey back to normal, the process of them recognizing what they've lost before the series even starts and finding it. So I don't know why Castle is in my head, because that wasn't because Nathan Fillion is whatever. So in that story, your main character is a detective, and her mom was murdered in mysterious circumstances long before the series starts. And her whole arc is peppered with her trying to figure out who killed her mom. So that's the C story. This is what will give them back what they lost, or a representation of healing from that loss. So your A, B, and C story, excuse me, examples over here. Anna, do you want to read this for me?
Sure. A story. Installment protagonist needs to turn his future father-in-law back into a human and stop proclaiming his historic misdeeds.
This is our opera singing plant father-in-law.
Right. B story. Static protagonist must use the assistance of his adoptive sister, Delgatra the Seer, to determine who placed the curse. Static protagonist and Delgatra heal her anger at him for running away and abandoning her to try and find his real parents.
Okay, so that's his B. So that's like, this is the family stuff going on. And then your C story, the thing that carries this on, because maybe he still hasn't found his true parents. He left to go find them. He still hasn't. What happens?
Delgatra gives the static protagonist a letter that arrived after he ran away that proves his mother is still alive.
Boom, boom, boom. So now we have our hook into our next book because we're like, okay, what happened with his family? Even if his next book involves totally different characters and a totally different, magical mystery scenario. So this is one of the easiest ways to engineer your actual beats in your series is to say, okay, I'm going to include this overarching mystery in my C story and make sure that each one of my individual books or my individual episodes is going to have a reference to it. And that will carry my readership through. And it's important when you do this to figure out how many books you plan to write so that you set it up in a way that feels appropriate and not lopsided. So in this one, this is the installment protagonist needs to find out what happened to his mistress and save his good name. And the B story might be that during the investigation, the static protagonist or your detective ends up in a tussle with Congressman Henry, who's a corrupt politician who had originally hired a private investigator against the installment protagonist. So it plays into that mystery. And then Congressman Henry is later ruled out as a suspect, but not after telling the series protagonist that Henry won't be happy until he's dead. So then we have, this possible major antagonist, or he could be, a secondary antagonist throughout the series. However, at the end of the book, when the series protagonist or detective is filing pictures away, and putting everything up because the murder is solved and the wife ended up doing it, the series protagonist sees the congressman in some of the pictures that he collected with a woman wearing a giant diamond that the static protagonist was kicked off the police force for allegedly stealing. So boom, 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 we get back into the larger arc for that detective. He lost his good standing, but he has indications that somehow or other Congressman Henry is involved in that. So he's going to have to keep going after this antagonistic character to figure out when this picture was taken or if it was taken after he supposedly stole the diamond, and he's going to have to interact and get into more tussling with this person. So that's kind of how your series arc into your actual installment arc. This is a cheat sheet for you because again, you're going to want to figure out like how many books are in your series. If you only write 5 books, then the way that you throw in those C story information or how much of it goes into each book is going to have to be a lot more and faster than if you're planning to write 10 or 20 books in a series and you just bank on this being really popular. So I would suggest if you have never written a series before, give yourself maybe 5. And I wouldn't even say that to somebody who's writing science fiction or fantasy, but detective novels tend to be a lot shorter. There's a lot more to be said about formula, and it's generally speaking easier to write them more quickly because you don't have to do a lot of world building. The world tends to kind of manifest itself around you. And the thing you're having to focus on is interior like continuity and that the logic fits together. So in conclusion, if this is brand new to you, start with 5. That is how you test the waters. That is roughly, if you're writing very short, 300 to 400,000 words that I would suggest like committing to this. So in your first installment, most of the time you will reveal either the loss, like the actual concrete loss that the person has, or the want, because you're breadcrumbing. We understand he wants to find his parents, but maybe you don't know why he wants to find his parents. Generally, don't provide both. But if it's a very short series, then yeah, you could do both. Your second installment are up to 25% of your books. You're going to reveal either the loss or the what that wasn't defined earlier. Again, you are breadcrumbing your audience into read through into finishing the series. Your 20 to 60% sections, you're going to breadcrumb the backstory and players in the original loss as you build up them investigating their own, I apologize, their own mystery, like their personal mystery. And then during the 60 to 75% mark, you're going to reveal key players and the elements needed to either solve the mystery or return back to normal or fulfill the want that they have. I'm being intentionally vague, but if you do have any questions, if that's not making sense, please tell me. Now, when you get to the end, your last books, your last installment -1, your penultimate book, you are going to have a story, like your actual installment story, has to have a character that mirrors the static protagonist situation. The static protagonist needs to learn from this because their own refusal to face their circumstance is what is stopping them from going back to normal. Normally, they have an aha moment about clues that they've either missed or misconstrued that gives them the key to defeating the bad guy. So, your last installment is the static protagonist actually solving their own mystery, but it puts their key players in jeopardy. So, if they're looking for their parents, their kid might get kidnapped in the last installment. If they're trying to get their good name back, they could be framed for something new in the last installment. So you're putting the things that they are considered key in their life in jeopardy in that last one. However, they're able to save the key, unlike during the original loss, actually defeat the bad guy and return to normal. Or you can kill them as a paragon of virtue and give them vindication and death, which I don't recommend. Very rarely do I see that done in a way that satisfies a readership, regardless of what genre it is in. But if that is what you want to do, plan it ahead so that the readership has the idea that death is possible. The expectations of safety for a character are something that really impact how an audience reacts to your writing. So if they are led to believe that everybody is safe because you're writing a cozy, and then you kill off that detective, which is pretty much what happens with Sherlock Holmes, you're not going to have happy people. But if you're writing something that is gritty and where other people they care about die, and death is part of life in your universe, you have more room to get away with killing off your main character. So just be aware, think about it. I would suggest not planning for it, but again, people have made it work, just not many. I don't think we have time to do the let's plan a murder section, so I do apologize for that. But I would suggest, breaking down your ideas, both again by what murder do you want them to solve, and then what is their problem throughout the series, and see if you can merge these two things together. If you are interested in watching this again, if this has gone by really fast, this will be on YouTube, and anybody who has signed up like on Eventbrite or Meetup or is in our Discord, I will send you links to this presentation. Are there any questions though? Because we do have like 5 minutes left. Fantastic. So with my last few minutes, I'm going to go ahead and say, if you are looking to make sure that your plots are solid, that you're putting enough misdirection on the page while still providing clues so that your readers are saying, aha, now I get what that meant, not where did that even show up in the book. Think about hiring us as your editors. You can find us at Toneworks Edits on Facebook. We're not very much on Twitter anymore, but we are on Blue Sky, LinkedIn, and then on Insta every once in a while. We do writers' lunches every single week. Where we have one of our editors give you free education, because that's kind of important to us, is that you have a way to learn. So that is us. And if you do have any questions, again, go ahead and put them in the chat or find us at Toneworks Edits on any of those places. And I hope you guys all had a great session. Those of you who watch us on YouTube, those of us who joined us in Zoom, I really appreciate it. If you found us on Eventbrite and this is the first time, go ahead and follow us there, because we do this again every single week. If you're interested in more free education, this is a great space for it. All right, I hope everybody has a great day, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, Shannon.
Bye.